So yes, I'm excited to come here today and talk about turtles. So my name again is Kerry Wixted, and I'm a program manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We're an NGO that works with all of the state fish and wildlife agencies across the United States and the different territories. And with that role, I also serve as the state agencies coordinator for the Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, aka PARC. And if you haven't heard of PARC before, I'm going to give my quick PARC plug, but we're all about forging proactive partnerships to conserve amphibians, reptiles, and the places that we live. So I work with the National Park Organization, but there are also regional parks like Northeast Park, which covers Maryland, and Southeast Park. So if you're interested in learning more about reptiles and amphibians and getting involved, I highly suggest you check out your local park. So I got into this role 2 years ago, and I was really surprised, even coming from a natural resources agency, just to find out how little reptiles are used to inspire conservation action and all sorts of different things. And so this quote from Dr. Sean O'Brien with NatureServe really resonated with me because it talks about their indispensable roles in ecosystems and across the planet that benefit all of us. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm here today to talk turtles and just talk about some of the amazing things that they do that people might not realize. So turtles are crucial to our ecosystems. They serve both as predators and as prey. And they also serve different roles. So some of our turtle species, like our box turtles, are actually seed dispersers. And a lot of the May apples that you might see out and about, there's a good chance that a box turtle pooped there at one time. And because going through the digestive tract of that box turtle actually enhances the germination of species like May apples. Turtles here, like our wood turtle, really important for essentially mixing up the soil and helping with some of those nutrient dynamics. And some of our aquatic turtles do the same thing with aquatic sediments at the bottom of the ponds. In different cultures and religions, turtles can also symbolize things such as wisdom, longevity, tranquility, and/or steadfastness. Here in North America, some cultures associate a turtle with the creation story, and essentially North America is believed to be Turtle Island, which has been built off the back of a turtle. In some areas, we have turtles that act as keystone species, and keystone species are species that support multiple other species. Locally, one of our keystone species is a beaver, but down in the southeastern United States, this gopher tortoise is really critical to over 350 different animals and insects that use these giant burrows that these gopher tortoises help to create. So some of these species would not exist without those gopher tortoise burrows. And those include rare species like the indigo snake and other specialists like gopher frogs and gopher mice. And then, of course, there are other species that, take advantage of having this giant burrow or that soil sifted up. And so some of those species include the cute little burrowing owls, possums, and skunks. You might be surprised to know that North America has really high turtle diversity, particularly in the southeastern United States, and it's second only to Southeast Asia, which also has a really high diversity of turtles. And finally, if those things don't sway you with turtles, well, they're just darn cute. So here's a cute little Blandings turtle, which is a species found in the Midwestern United States. So as you may know, the turtle shell is attached to its vertebrae and ribs, and the top of the shell is known as the carapace, while the bottom of the shell is known as the plastron. Turtles have scales on their shell, and those scales are called scutes. And those scutes are actually made of a very thin keratin layer. So keratin is that protein that makes up your hair and your nails. And so that keratin layer exists over the bony layer of the shell. So turtles actually require UV light and specifically UVB wavelengths. And that helps them to synthesize vitamin D because they don't really get that from their diet. So they need that UV radiation to help with the vitamin D synthesis. And vitamin D is really important for their bones and also for the shell growth. Therefore, practices like painting turtle shells can actually be problematic not only can some of the chemicals from those paints be absorbed into the turtle system, but it also blocks those important UV rays from accessing the turtle and helping the turtle to synthesize that vitamin D. And so that can lead to bone and shell growth issues. So as I mentioned, those scutes are made up of keratin. The keratin is actually a dead layer on top of growing layers. So as turtles grow, occasionally you will see those scutes kind of flaking off as it's shed and replaced. In Maryland, we have about 22 species, and I say about 22 because our knowledge keeps changing. We have species, unfortunately, that are being introduced or becoming naturalized in the state. And then there's also a lot of things happening with reptile and amphibian taxonomy at the moment. So some of these are, subspecies are getting lumped together, some are getting split. So that's why I'm just playing it safe and saying we have about 22 species. Out of that 22, 19 of those species are native to the state and 3 are introduced or naturalized. So one of the coolest turtles that we have here in Maryland is this cute little bog turtle. It's actually the smallest turtle in North America and one of the smallest turtles found throughout the world. It also is a federally threatened species, and it reaches a top carapace length of only about 4.5 to only about 4 to 4.5 inches. So not really big at all. It has this orange mark on either side of its head, and essentially it's found in spring-fed wetlands. So wetlands that are getting groundwater influxes and all of that. It feeds on almost anything that it can find within those wetlands, and they only lay 2 to 4 eggs each year, and sometimes it can take them up to 11 years to reach sexual maturity. So nests that are not consumed by nest predators like raccoons will actually hatch this time of year, but they face a lot of threats. So this is a classic example of a seepage habitat that you would find bog turtles in here in Maryland. This is actually a Maryland bog turtle site, and it has all of these tussock sedges and skunk cabbage all about. But you also notice that this wetland is very open because having that full sunlight in those wetlands is really important for those turtles. So each year, researchers will go out to these known bog turtle sites to inventory and monitor the existing populations. And most of these populations are found on private property. So working with landowners is really, really critical for bog turtle conservation. Excuse me. So in addition, keeping these areas open from woody vegetation is also really, really important. And it's not really good to bring in a lot of heavy equipment and machinery. So sometimes things like eco-goats are employed to help keep that woody vegetation down. So moving along to probably one of our most well-known species of turtle, it's the box turtle here in Maryland. And you can find them mating from April through October here in the state. These are a pair that were mating in my backyard a few years ago. And like the bog turtles, it can take them a long time to reach sexual maturity. So it can take them up to 5 to 10 years on average. And most box turtles, like those bog turtles, only lay 1 clutch of eggs each year. Depending on when the eggs are laid, they'll either hatch late in the summer or early in the fall. And those young turtles actually have this very distinct knobby ridge going down their carapace. So that's one way to discern some young box turtles out and about. So leaf litter is really important for box turtles. It helps provide camouflage, it provides that habitat, and also provides a good spot to find a lot of food because invertebrates are a large portion of our box turtles' diets. They also like to eat things like mayapple, strawberries, and other fruits as well. And one thing to note about box turtles is that they do love munching on slugs. So it's not uncommon to see a box turtle with a big old slimy slug stash or essentially like a layer of slime going across their mouth and all of that. That means they just had a nice, delicious meal. So while box turtles are have seem to be common, most states within their range, they're actually declining species. One uncommon turtle species that you can find in Maryland is the eastern spiny softshell. And then, like most of our other turtles here in the state, it actually has this flat, rubbery shell. And that allows it to essentially glide through these shallow mountain streams where it's found and also be able to dig itself down into sandbars. And you can see that it has this little pointed nose, so it likes to dig all the way down in the sand and essentially stick its little nose up out of the water so it can breathe. This species is only found in Garrett County, but certainly it is found in other states like West Virginia and Virginia as well. And interestingly enough, it can breathe underwater, even though it does, also breathe air. So it has this special pharyngeal lining, cloacal lining, which is in its butt portion, and then also in its skin that allows it to essentially get some oxygen from the water. So they have a special courtship ritual too, and you might see this with some other aquatic turtle species like red-eared sliders. Essentially, the males will come up and nudge the female's head, and he'll take his front legs and kind of flutter them in front of her to kind of court her. And he'll swim above her and around her, but he won't clasp her onto her unless she shows that she's receptive to him. So they typically breed in May, and they'll lay their eggs on sandbars or in loose soil along those cool mountain streams. And again, they're mostly found in Garrett County here in Maryland, but they're more common in other states. If you go into areas with slow-moving water like ponds and lakes, you're likely to see our two very common pond turtle species. Those include the invasive red-eared slider and the native eastern painted turtle. So the red-eared slider is an invasive species in Maryland, and most of the populations that we have been established from pet releases. Some of the largest influxes of red-eared sliders into our natural ecosystems occurred in the 1980s at the height of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle craze. As their name suggests, they have that characteristic red stripe going down behind their eye and yellow stripes on their head and their face. And some of the problems with them is they essentially outcompete our native species in some of these similar habitats, as well as spread diseases to them. So as they age, those red-eared sliders, they might lose that characteristic red stripe, so makes it a little more difficult for them to be identified. But if you look at the underside of their shells, the plastron, it's going to be bright yellow with dark blotches around the edge. And then the other thing that I'm showing here with this picture is that their scutes don't line up on the back of their shell. So that's another way you can discern it from the native eastern painted turtle, which has these white bars that essentially are parallel between the scutes on the back. The other thing with the red-ear or the painted turtles, you'll see that they have yellow stripes that kind of turn into those reddish-orange stripes, and that is on their heads. And on the underside of their bellies or on their shells, it's going to be, bright yellow or orange color. So we have eastern painted turtles throughout much of the state. If you go to the western part of the state, you might also see those Midland painted turtles. They look very similar, but they don't have these scutes that line up, essentially. So one fun fact about the eastern painted turtles before I move on is that they can actually survive winter months frozen under ice, and they have this special strategy to breathe underwater. It's colloquially known as butt breathing, but the scientific term is called cloacal respiration, and essentially it's a form of respiration without, I'm messing this up. It's a form of almost like fermentation, essentially, that happens. And so they're able to do that and live for several months under the water just using that cloacal respiration. And I see a question about where red-eared sliders are native to. They are native to the Midwestern United States and like parts of the Ohio drainage. So interestingly enough, there's sections in West Virginia where they're actually native to, but the eastern parts of West Virginia, they are not native to. And so we're not the only state that struggles with red-eared slider issues from pet releases. So another turtle you might find in aquatic areas is our northern diamondback terrapin. And they're quite unique, not just because they're our state reptile, but there are only local turtle species that can live in brackish water. So in the early 1900s, they actually were a gourmet food item, and populations crashed during this time throughout their range, essentially because there was unregulated and unsustainable capturing of these turtles to satisfy that food demand. So even today, some areas you'll still see Diamondback terrapins gracing menus, but it's not as large of an industry as it used to be. And so we have the northern subspecies of Diamondback terrapin, which can be found all the way up to Cape Cod and down to Cape Hatteras in North Carolina. And then the southern, south of Cape Hatteras, you'll typically start to see some of those southern subspecies. And there's a few really cool ones like the Florida Diamondback terrapin in very southern habitats there. So their coloration is quite distinct. They have this kind of grayish white pattern on their heads with the black blotches, and then their shells are a light brown or black with some of those ridges on there. So they have some different adaptations to survive in these salty environments, and one of them is actually they have these glands right by their eyes that help excrete that excess salt from their environments. So they're a species that's highly threatened by roads and habitat loss. We also see some illegal collection happening with these species. So snapping turtles are like living dinosaurs that we have in our backyards because they've changed relatively little over millions of years. And they're a common species across many of our waterways. So you'll be hard pressed not to find a snapping turtle near you. So they're also a species, the only species in turtle species in Maryland that can still be commercially harvested with a permit. So snapping turtles mostly solitary throughout their lives, except they will leave their aquatic habitat during the breeding season. And sometimes these females will travel extremely long distances, like up to a mile away from aquatic habitats to either find places to breed or nest. They often go back to the same places to nest year after year. So during this time, as you might imagine, they're very vulnerable out of the water, and they can be quite cranky if you do approach them because they understand that they're vulnerable. And we do see well-meaning people who see them away from the water and try to take them back to aquatic habitats, but it actually has a bit of a negative impact on them. So this time of year, you might see some of the young hatching. They hatch essentially from August to October, and I see a picture of one in the chat there. And the young are really distinct because they have these distinct spikes on the back of their carapace. You'll see them on the spikes on adults as well, but sometimes with age, they round out a little bit more. And snapping turtles lay their eggs on land. So two declining species that we have in Maryland are wood turtles and spotted turtles. And the wood turtles, as their name implies, essentially their carapace kind of looks like somebody carved it out of wood. So it has these pyramidal scoops on the back that are brown, so they kind of stick up a little bit. And even though their names are wood turtles, they spend a surprising amount of time in the water. So they love to live in and around clear moving streams or streams with gravel bottoms. So wood turtles are in decline throughout much of their range, including here in Maryland. And they essentially are threatened by things like habitat loss, fragmentation, degradation, and illegal trade. So they are illegally collected for the pet trade. So currently, the Maryland Zoo actually has some wood turtles that had been confiscated from illegal collection, and they weren't able to be released back into the wild. So those wood turtles are being used right now for head starting programs. And I think they recently released some hatchlings, or they're getting ready to release some hatchlings from that project. Moving on to the spotted turtles, they have variable numbers of spots on their backs. And so sometimes it can be a lot, sometimes it can be a little. And there's no rhyme or reason to how those spots are on the backs of their shells. I liken it to somebody just flicking a paintbrush and leaving those spots. And in some areas, there are spotted turtles with completely black shells as well. So they live in shallow wetlands such as wet meadows and wet crevices, bogs, and swamps throughout the state. And much like the wood turtle, this species is protected in much of its range because it has declining populations. So I can't give a turtle talk without at least mentioning some of our sea turtles that show up in the bay and or along coastal areas of Maryland. So not only does Maryland have the smallest North American turtle species, but we also have the largest turtle species in the world. And that is the leatherback sea turtle, which clocks in at almost 6 feet in length. And much like the spiny softshell, it has this leathery shell. And the reason it has this leathery shell is because it has to dive very high depths to get to its favorite food, which is jellyfish. And if it had a hard shell, that pressure change from diving really deep underwater would cause that hard shell to pop off. So leatherbacks are extraordinary for lots of different reasons, but one of the really cool things about them is their expansive geographic distribution, and it's because of their ability to survive in really warm waters and cold waters. So you can find them up and down the coast in North America, and they're certainly a migratory species. There are one that you won't really see up in the bay, though. You'll be lucky to see it off the coast of Maryland, at least off that Atlantic coast. One species that you can occasionally find up, getting up into upper reaches of the bay, even as far as Baltimore County, is this loggerhead sea turtle. So this is the most commonly spotted sea turtle in Maryland. So let's get into turtles and turtle threats. So there are around 356 turtle species around the world. Anybody want to guess what percentage are threatened with extinction? Is it 10%, 20%, 30, 40, or greater than 50%? You can type that in the chat. Give me some guesses. Seeing a couple high guesses. We got some splits here, seeing 20s and 50s. For all of you that answered greater than 50%, you're correct. So more than 50% of our turtle species around the world are threatened in some way, shape, or form. And so that's a really, really large number. And the largest threat to our turtles is habitat loss and degradation, and that includes things like roads, which bisect turtle territories and can cause road mortalities. We also have climate change that's affecting our turtles, particularly by skewing things like sex ratios. So many of our turtle species, the sex of the eggs that they lay is determined by the incubation temperatures. And so warmer years are going to produce more females, hot chicks, and cooler temperatures are going to produce more males, the cool dudes. And also things like precipitation can also affect hatchling rates and hatchling success. So all of that with climate change is certainly impacting our turtle species and not in a good way. So in addition, disease is another thing that happens to some of our local turtles. So this is a picture of a turtle with ranavirus, which essentially is a deadly disease to many species like our box turtles. We see this popping up a lot in turtles that are in the illegal trade, many times because they're essentially pushed in these high concentration conditions and makes it really easy to pass on diseases to one another. And sometimes that also spills over into our local wild populations. We then have a lot of predators. So turtle eggs and turtle hatchlings are essentially like chicken nuggets that you will find out in the wild. But when we have predator populations like red fox populations and raccoon populations that are artificially supplemented by people, either by feeding or by illegally treating them for things like mange, that happens at the expense of the animals that those predators eat. And we see a lot of this happening. Turtle nest predation is extremely high. And with long sexual maturity rates and low numbers of eggs being laid, there aren't very many hatchlings that can be taken to essentially replace those adults in the long run. And then finally, we'll see things like illegal trade, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. So as I just kind of mentioned, turtles are highly vulnerable to loss of breeding adults and even loss of those juveniles and those hatchlings. So we have a phrase that we like to use in our circles, and that's hashtag every turtle counts. So as you can see from this graphic that was produced by Melissa Gonzalez with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and built off of data from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, species like snapping turtles can take an extremely long time to reach sexual maturity. And in that same time span that it takes one snapping turtle to be able to become sexually mature and start laying eggs, things like black bears could already have produced 7 mature offspring, and white-tailed deer, well, their progeny and their progeny's progeny could essentially create 628 individuals. So when you look at these different reproductive ages, these general age ranges for our different turtle species and the number of eggs that they produce in their clutches, often only 1 clutch per year, you can easily see why every turtle counts. So here's another statistic for you. Between 1996 and 2008, what percentage of illegal wildlife trade that was intercepted contained reptiles? So what percentage? Was it 20%, 30%, 40, 50, or greater than 60? And this is from a traffic report. I'm seeing some higher numbers now. Yep, those of you saying greater than 60, it is true. So it was around 70%. And so this again was from a traffic bulletin that was put together. And you can see, some of the other species that are illegally traded. It's not just turtles and other reptiles. Reptiles include turtles, crocodiles, and other species like lizards as well. But we often hear a lot about mammals and birds in the illegal wildlife trade, but not turtles and our reptiles. So these are just some of the different headlines from newspapers all around the United States with some of the cases that have been happening. And not only do we have loss of these individuals from the populations, but we see the spread of infectious diseases, we see the spread of invasive turtles, and we see loss of a lot of our conservation dollars that are being used to essentially bring these turtles back, being lost to poachers. So between 2018 and 2022, 9 major cases involving over 22,000 turtles were confiscated essentially here or known about here in the United States. And we like to say that this number is the tip of the iceberg because most of this illegal turtle trade is not being caught. We see these turtles being taped up, put into socks, dehydrated, and being, not given food because the less that they move and the less that they excrete waste, the harder it is to detect them. And this is one of those symptoms of ranavirus. This is actually one of those confiscated turtles. You'll see plaque and buildup. It's a respiratory disease, and it is almost always fatal for our turtles. And just recently, to show you that this is also happening here around us, just recently somebody was found in Virginia to be selling box turtles illegally online on Facebook Marketplace. So another local-ish case was in 2019 where over 3,500 protected Diamondback terrapins and their eggs were poached from New Jersey. And so we see a lot of this happening, unfortunately. So because this is a big problem and people have known this is an issue for a long time, the Collaborative to Combat the Illegal Trade in Turtles, or the CCITT, was formed at a Northeast PARC meeting in 2018. And essentially the mission is to advance efforts to better understand, prevent, and eliminate the illegal collection and trade of North American species. And so This is a group that I'm involved with PARC. It is now, since it began in 2018 and 2020, it became an official national task team of PARC. And so we have a number of people, over 180 folks that represent biologists, law enforcement, and researchers working on this group to try to deal with the many different facets of the illegal trade. So while the CCITT is essentially a closed group, it has a membership application, and we try to keep it mostly to agency professionals working in the field with our turtles. There are other things that you can do as individuals to help turtles. And one of the biggest things you can do is keeping wild turtles wild. So remembering that every turtle counts, and even one individual taken from an area can affect populations at times. Another thing you can do is not publicly share locations of turtles. So even things like posting them on social media makes it easy for poachers to find those turtle populations. And so one of the things you can do with like iNaturalist is actually change the geoprivacy settings of anything that you upload relating to turtles. Our general rule of thumb is only posting things down to county level. So instead of saying you found it in a particular park or in a particular waterway, just say, hey, I found this cool turtle in Anne Arundel County. You can also help to report wildlife crime. So we have the Natural Resources Police here in Maryland that you can report suspected crime to, but you can also report it to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there are poacher tip lines that are available. Another thing you can do is getting the shell off the road. And first and foremost, it's really important to make sure it's safe to take the turtle off the road. Safe not just for you, but also for that turtle and for other people that might be traveling down the road. And you always want to place it in the direction that it's traveling, because if you put it back on the side that it came from, it's just going to go back across the road. Even though you might want to relocate it to a better area, it's actually best just to put it over on the other side, wherever it's going. We like to say turtle knows best. They kind of have an internal GPS that tells them where they should be going. And if you see a turtle that's injured or might need assistance, you can take it to a local vet or a wildlife rehabilitator. And there's this great site, this animalhelpnow.org, that you can essentially go to wherever you are in the United States and find lists of permitted turtle rehabilitators or other wildlife rehabilitators. Some of the things you can do in your backyards is making them a home for them by planting those native plants. So anything that has fruits on them, they're usually attractive to our wild turtles, like raspberries and blackberries and all of that. And because they eat insects and other invertebrates like worms and slugs, you should limit pesticide use in those areas that you're trying to keep those turtles. Don't move them around. And don't supplement predators, either intentionally by leaving pet food out overnight and feeding raccoons and foxes, or unintentionally by not securing your trash or not cleaning up underneath your bird feeders. Keeping cats indoors is important as well, because cats outside can be a threat to young turtles. And then just in general, if you're mowing, if you can do essentially a turtle sweep before you do your mowing, or set your mower blades to about 4 inches, that'll help with, preventing some turtle deaths in your backyards. Some key education messaging relating to turtles is just, and these are things that we try to put out with our PARC network, is to essentially tell people that turtles are important, but they're vulnerable and they need intervention. And we have a lot of these resources on the PARC webpage. These are pictures from our Wild Turtle Week social media kit that we've put out the last 2 years. And then things like your local Northeast Park also has some infographics and materials to teach about your local turtles. If you want more information, we do have our Wild Turtle Week coming up in June of 2024. If you followed our last 2 Wild Turtle Weeks, we were doing them in May around World Turtle Day, but it got to be too much having World Turtle Week and Amphibian Week in the same month for our PARC network. So we're moving Turtle Week to June, right around World Sea Turtle Day. You can also check out your Northeast PARC. And so Northeast PARC has great information. They also have a turtle working group. So if you want to get involved in different aspects of turtle conservation, including turtle, education and outreach, then you can check out the Northeast PARC. And then, of course, at the national park level, we're always looking for help with some of our different projects. All of PARC's work couldn't be done without ARC, the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy. And so they are the nonprofit that helps to support our park. And so they also have lots of projects, particularly on the ground conservation projects within these priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas, or PARCas, that anything you can do to help support that effort will help our local reptiles and amphibians. And they've got great information on their website, including a very cool blog. And then finally, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources has pages for all the different turtle species found in Maryland. So you can also find a wealth of information on that website. So I'm also going to post that Wakelet link in the chat that has some of these resources and ways to sign up for PARC and Northeast PARC on it. And my email is also there, so if you have any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you, Kerry. Everybody give Kerry a round of applause virtually. Thanks. I learned a bunch of new things, as I usually do with your presentations. We got a bunch of questions, a lot of popular topic. Great, everybody's here. Keep the questions coming through. We're going to start working through them. You answered a lot while we were going, but we did see that picture of a snapping turtle coming out of that hole, and that was in Maine. And I saw that, and I was like, are snapping turtles all the way up in Maine? And I Googled their range map, and sure thing, they are. They go pretty far north, huh?
Yep.
So it looks like that's what that is, Julie. Somebody asked about where they lay their eggs, on land or water. You mentioned on land, but this relates a little bit to that. Julie asked, do snapping turtles burrow in the ground? If so, how deep?
They do, and they'll burrow into the mud, particularly in the fall, to essentially get through the winter. I don't know how deep they can go, but I do know that they do have that cloacal respiration, just like the painted turtles. So that allows them to essentially freeze in those different environments or stay underwater for a significant amount of time.
Wow, that's so cool. And so do they still just stay unmoving for the winter? They kind of hibernate there?
Yeah, and essentially, like, throughout the winter, because it's that respiration, like, without a lot of oxygen, essentially, it creates a lot of lactic acid, which builds up in their muscles. And so early in the spring, you'll see turtles often doing that turtle yoga and things like that. And that's essentially to help break down some of that lactic acid that's built up in their bodies over the winter.
Cool. I can imagine somebody doing blood tests on turtles to figure out these fun facts like lactic acid in their systems.
Yeah.
Somebody, Dan Wixted, I don't know if there's any relation to you, Kerry, but he said he had to leave. We will have a recording to this meeting afterwards. Everybody wondering, we'll make sure to send it out to everybody. Chris Kinney asked, what symptoms are present for ranavirus? It seemed like there was some eye funk happening. You want to describe some of that?
Yeah, one of the things with ranavirus is it can present like other diseases. So visually, it's hard to discern if it is ranavirus. You really have to do lab tests. But a lot of times you're going to see, crusty, swollen eyes, that plaque in the mouth, trouble breathing, and all of that. So those are usually those symptoms of ranavirus in turtles. Certainly ranavirus, as its name suggests, rana being frog, meaning frog, it also affects other aquatic wildlife like frogs and salamanders and toads. So you'll see massive die-offs, particularly of tadpoles and larval salamanders in the spring. That can be a symptom, and you'll see a lot of like blood and things like that kind of in their bodies, pulling up. That's part of those symptoms. If you want to learn more about ranavirus, on October 14th, it's a Saturday, the Global Ranavirus Consortium is going to be giving an overview talk for the Partners of Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, and I'll try to dig up that link and put it in the chat, but it's a free webinar that folks can join in on and learn a little bit about rhinovirus. There's several different strains around the world, and so it can even affect fish too.
Great. Thank you, Kerry. The next question was, where do we report problems? And I searched and I got the link for Maryland Wildlife Crime Stoppers, and I put the phone number in the chat. So that's where you would report any suspected illegal trade in turtles, John. Is that any other resources you might recommend, or is that where you'd send people?
That's the Wildlife Crime Stoppers. On the PARC website, we also link to the different state natural resource agencies that you can report wildlife crimes to. So not just turtles, but other species. And then also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have a tip line that you can call, or now you can send in like an email, like an anonymous email, and put in your, information about poachers and things like that. One thing to keep in mind, just like with helping turtles across the road, make sure that if you are encountering a poaching situation, you think about your safety and the safety of others first. So collecting as much information as you can, like license plate tags and other identifiable characters is important, but don't do that at the expense of your own safety.
Absolutely. Great. Yeah. And we might have some people coming in from out of state. So yeah, look at that federal number, Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as your local state wildlife DNR. Deborah mentioned she moved a box turtle out of the road yesterday. Good job. And yeah, make sure you stay safe when you're pulling off the road. I have done that last spring. And this kind of gets to a question you may have mentioned a little bit. Are we getting good at detecting times when we have these sort of migration movements? And I know you mentioned on another listserv this morning about migrations. There's some times when we can watch out for turtles. Does it vary by species? And could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, typically May and June are the high times of year that we see a lot of turtles crossing the road. And for species like box turtles, they're usually out after a thunderstorm or a heavy rain. So those mornings after a heavy rain, really be mindful of turtles that might be crossing the road. The reason May and June is such a high time is that's usually the breeding season for many of our species.
Cool. I have some questions of my own, but we're going to get through our audience first. Will turtles eat invasive worms like jumping worms?
So they certainly eat invasive night crawlers. I don't know if they eat the jumping worms, but I imagine since they're very similar to some of those night crawler species that they probably do. Unfortunately, I can't see our turtles having a appreciable effect on those jumping worm populations, though.
Similar, back on worms, are the hammerhead worms bad for turtles?
I'm not sure about that. I know that the hammerhead worms eat earthworms, but all of our earthworms, or most of our earthworms in Maryland, are not native anyways. They do have a toxin in them, and I don't know if that would affect turtles or deter turtles, so I'm not exactly sure.
And these questions are so complicated to know because I'm sure, you get to watch a turtle and they have a varied diet, and there's probably a certain threshold where something might become toxic, but maybe not. And so, yeah, you'd have to probably feed a turtle 100 worms to find out if it has some reaction. And is that a natural thing that would happen anyway? So it's probably hard to find out. But these questions are really hard, really challenging to tackle. What would cause a box turtle to have a yellow carapace? Oh, that's from Marcia. That came to me directly. So
okay. Yeah. Well, there is a high variability in the carapace patterns of box turtles. Some of them are super bright orange, have little like dark coloration, and some of them are super dark. So bright yellow carapace could be just a genetic variation or something like that. And then some subspecies of box turtles, I think like the ornate box turtles, if I'm remembering correctly, are typically more colorful than our eastern species.
We got some thanks. We got some congratulations. Awesome presentation. What's the best way to pick up a turtle when you help it across the road?
Yeah. Well, for things like box turtles and all of that, really you have to think about your safety, but then just hold it from the middle and take it across. And I see some questions about snappers. They certainly can be crankier when you're trying to help them. For small snappers, if you can hold them all the way at the back, like right before their back claws, that'll prevent them from essentially getting all the way back, their head all the way back to bite you and all that. And then you move them across. I will warn you, they do musk, so they'll release a really, really foul odor. Again, not appreciative of you helping them.
Yeah.
For larger snapping turtles, one of the things that I have done is either take like a piece of cardboard or your collar mats and kind of coax them up on top, and then you can pull them across on one of those mats or the cardboard. Sometimes, if I don't have any of that or I don't have a big enough piece, I have assisted with turtle crossing as a turtle crossing guard. So I just get a big stick and poke them and get them to move along. So I've been in situations where we've had traffic stopped on either way, and we're just essentially helping to move it along. But you
I
never want to
found,
pick them up by their tail, because the tail is attached to the vertebrae, and the pressure of their body weight on that tail and their spine could potentially damage the spine.
right. I found when I get near snapping turtles, they generally start moving. They don't want to be around me anyway. So I almost wonder if just standing behind them close to them, they're going to be getting on and moving along. Cool.
Yeah, we had one at DNR that in Annapolis that she would cross the road every year, and she would inevitably always do it like right at the end of the day because she would be right by the daycare, so we always had to go out and assist her. And she just got so used to us being there that sometimes she just lay on the road. So
Didn't even
that's
care.
when having to drag her across was really helpful.
Right, right. Um, Great, and some more thanks. Thomas says, I live on the Chesapeake Bay and along the sandy shoreline. In the spring, there are lots of turtle shells. Is there a way to protect the eggs along? I think this may be turtle eggshells, perhaps. Is there a way
Mhm.
to protect the eggs along the shoreline from native predators? Do otters eat the eggs?
So yes, otters will eat the eggs and minks and other stuff too. Skunks are also egg predators as well. There are websites where you can find plans on how to put essentially like some fencing with some of that, bendable metal fencing and all of that. You can put those down and around those turtle nests. You do have to be careful just to make sure the holes in that fencing are going to be wide enough so those hatchlings can get out, because they can dry out really fast if they're food or water source. So there is some of that information online to put those things out there.
Cool. Um, Somebody's got turtles coming back year after year. That's great. Brenda Beal, thanks for joining us. What impact does the push for riparian buffers near creeks and wetlands have on turtle habitat?
Well, those riparian buffers, I imagine, would be good for turtle habitat because it's helping to stabilize the soils and also bring back native vegetation that'll help support organisms for those turtles. I imagine that, some of that disturbance with those riparian buffers initially might dig up some of those nests and things of that nature, but overall, the long-term benefits of those buffers are probably going to be positive.
I would think
And
so too. Yeah.
yeah, and most turtles, even the aquatic ones, will go a decent distance away from the edge of the water to nest. Like I've found snapping turtles coming all the way up the hill to nest in my backyard, and painted turtles, they'll come all the way up the hill to find an open area to nest in.
Mhm. I've seen that too. Deal Island Road in Somerset County has a black pipe along the road to stop turtle crossings. Is this a good strategy? And let me also mention a little plug. I remember hearing about this, and I did a little bit of research on it, but I'll also mention we have a fencing expert, a wildlife fencing expert recommended by Kerry, who's going to come and speak to us in 2024. I'll find the month here in a moment, but go ahead, Kerry, and tell us about those fencing and for turtle crossings.
Yeah, so this has been a push in certain areas, like the Deal Island Road. I believe, if I'm remembering that spot correctly, it's in a very important spot for nesting terrapins. And we've seen some heavy mortalities of females crossing the road to get to the other side to essentially nest. And so I think that's one of the spots where the fencing and the piping was put up specifically for turtles. I know nationally, right now with the bipartisan infrastructure law, there was some funding for wildlife crossings, and some folks are actually working with their Department of Transportation to apply for funding to do essentially more of those crossings for reptiles and amphibians too in some of the well-known locations where that road mortality happens. I can't speak for the effectiveness of that particular spot because I wasn't involved in that project, but a lot of these do have positive impacts as long as they're installed properly and are being used by those wildlife.
Good, good. Yeah. And I'm putting in the chat, we're going to have on January 17th, so just a few months out, Steve Mars with Animex Wildlife Fencing is going to speak on the topic, what makes a good wildlife fence, an exploration into identifying, implementing, and maintaining an effective wildlife fencing project. And there are a lot of nuances to fencing for critters like this. So I'm going to pop that in the chat. And go ahead and you can register for those soon on our website. So on our website. So we'll send out reminders to everybody. Okay. Next up, will the recording be available? Yes. Ben asked, could we get you mentioned a Rana virus webinar, or was it a conference? You got a link to that?
There's a webinar that's going to kick off the symposia for the weekend, and it's a global conference, so it's all free. I just posted that link in the chat. I believe the Rana virus talk is 11 o'clock on Saturday, October 14th.
Great, many thanks coming along here. How can we support projects for wildlife crossings?
That's a good one. And so a lot of those projects are happening at the state level. So, and it's between the State Department of Transportation and the state wildlife agencies. So, so those are, usually the agencies that are going to be involved. So consulting with them would be the best course of action.
And I find it seems like, I think that Deal Island one was a, result of citizens calling in and making noise about it.
Yeah, I think that one, actually, I think Kerry Samus might have been one of the people who is integral with that Deal Island one, if that's the project that I'm thinking of.
Right. So some people, yeah, you can get involved, get active, and you can make a difference. I'm seeing that with a lot of our work we're doing a lot on quail and bobwhites in the state, and we have the Quail Forever chapter is just doing great work, and you can do all sorts of things and that you're passionate about. So, okay, thank you. Are state wildlife agencies consulted during new or major road construction projects regarding wildlife passage?
Yes, they certainly are. So a lot of times there is an environmental consulting component to those projects, especially like if there are any rare, threatened, or endangered species in the area that has to go through environmental review with the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, at least for Maryland, but I imagine a lot of other states are similar.
Cool. Now we have a couple minutes left, so I get to get to my questions now, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And maybe if you're up for staying a couple minutes after, everybody, we want to respect your time. We understand if you need to jump off at one. A couple of fun questions. One is, I saw that mating behavior. I've never seen that live of those box turtles. Do all turtles have that sort of mating behavior where is it the male that's up on his hind legs like that? Is that how they all do it?
That I'm not sure about. So the males can also get on top of the females. So the box turtles have that divot on the bottom of the shell to allow them to kind of mount the females. And originally, I have a whole series of photos from that foray. So there was one where he was on top and then he fell back and all of that. But they essentially, their cloacas have to touch. So that is how the process happens with turtles. I don't know if all of them do it that way, but some way, somehow, those cloacas have to touch. So.
Right. I'm often amazed at how birds manage to make this happen. I watch birds. I'm like, how do they ever make that? Whatever. Yeah. We'll not go too deep into that. This is made for children to watch. They mentioned the excreting salt out of the eyes on the box turtles, and I was actually had the real pleasure of going on to Florida and seeing a ton of loggerhead turtles. There were hundreds. I mean, on the whole beach there were hundreds. I mean, we saw dozens. And they also had that, it looks like tears coming out of their eyes. And a lot of people say it looks like they're crying, but yeah, it seems like I looked it up and it was, yeah, the same salt excretion behavior
Mhm.
happening there. Do you know, do all turtles have that? Do you know? Or
I
maybe
don't
just
think
more
all of them
brackish
do because
saltwater,
I think it's just the brackish saltwater
right?
species.
Right. I was also surprised to learn we had leatherbacks here and loggerheads as well. I was in Florida, and of course, maybe that's the epicenter of them, but is it pretty common? Or is it, I know in Florida, if you're going to see them, there's real strong protocols for, well, certainly lights and using only red
Mhm.
lights if you're going to be out on the beach, so you don't just sort of disorient them with bright white lights. Are there places you can safely and view turtles and here in Maryland?
Most of those sea turtles are passing by. So I think that there was a sea turtle that recently nested at Assateague Island, but most of those sea turtles are going to be nesting south of us. And so, like the leatherbacks are just, spotted out off the coast of Ocean City, floating by during its migration. And those loggerheads occasionally will come up and feed in the bay, but they're not going to be nesting.
Gotcha.
So the nesting is the thing that is most impacted by those lights at night. But the light at night is a good question because we are in peak migration season for birds right now. Like this is the biggest week right now. So
Mm.
turning off those porch lights and other outdoor lighting, if you can turn it off, this week is the week to do it for migrating birds and bats. Um,
Oh, that's great to know. I'm going to make sure to put some posts out on social media to mention.
Yeah, there's some like bird casts and it'll show you like the, images of how many birds are flying over. And I know Lights Out Baltimore, unfortunately, was very busy the last couple days
Mm,
collecting birds that have struck buildings.
mm, mm. And they are able to avoid them if the lights are out. Is that part of the, if the lights are out, they won't hit the buildings as badly?
Yeah, the light disorients them. And with bats and things like that, a lot of times that light on glass, they'll mistake it as water. And so migratory bats like red bats and hoary bats typically will hit buildings too.
Mm, mm. We have one more question coming from Bernard. If you have a few more minutes on, does the eye color of turtles have significance?
For some species, yes. Some species you can tell the differences in the sexes by looking at their eye colors. So box turtles are an example of that. Typically, females have brown eyes and the males have red eyes. I say typically because there are some out there that have, females that have showed up with bright red eyes too. So it's not always a good indicator of sex.
Okay. And you mentioned also my last question. I mean, I have a few more, but this is my last kind of good one is the temps, you mentioned temperatures affecting male versus females. Is that across all turtles or is it just particular species?
I believe it's most turtle species. There's
Right.
that temperature dependency. So certainly our sea turtles are species that are affected by that temperature. Diamondback terrapins are a local species that's affected by that temperature. So I hate
And
to
if
say
you,
all because like there are always exceptions,
yeah.
but I'd say the majority are affected by
Right.
temperature. And that's true for a lot of reptiles as well.
Now I'm curious, given that these turtles also have ranges that span such huge, latitude variations from Maine to, Florida, how how are they having males and females if they're existing in places where you're certainly having big temperature differences at the same time of year? Is it just, are they locally adapted to have their own range of temperatures to depending where they are?
Yeah, and they also, individual turtles are going to lay their eggs at different times of the year. So it's not like all of our turtles in Maryland lay their eggs that first week of April. Some of them are April, some of them wait till June to lay their eggs. So you're going to have those variations in temperature throughout an individual population and species. So,
Right. Cool.
and the temperature, it's something with the development of the embryos. I don't remember all the parts of it, but yeah, there's a medical reason why it's affected.
Right, I'm sure. Well, I appreciate you mentioning the importance of private landowners. A lot of what I work on is making sure we get private landowners doing the best conservation practices for their land. And 92% of Maryland is owned by private landowners. So if you own land, you have a great opportunity to contribute to conservation in the state and beyond. So definitely so much of that, hearing about the bog turtles being predominantly on private land, it's really important to make sure if you know, have friends who own land, you own land yourself. Yeah, take some time to learn and share share these kind of knowledge with others, and you have a great opportunity to give back. Well, with that, I will close. Thank you so much, Kerry. It's really a pleasure. We had a great audience here, great questions. Thanks for everybody for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next month for Forest Health. If you're wondering about what's going on with your trees, or any trees are dying, come on in, come ask your questions for our local entomology expert. Have a good day.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
Kerry.
you so much.
Take care.